I've been playing video games for about as long as I can remember. I was interested in the medium ever since I was young, and I was always trying to get my hands on new games to play. But new games don't come cheap, especially not for a kid with no money of his own. Because of this, as much as it pains me to think of now, sometimes I would make my way down to GameStop to trade in my old games that I didn't want anymore for some money to put towards new ones. Even though I was used to trading in games from time to time, as I got older, I realized that somewhere along the way, I just stopped doing that. Even games that I didn't really enjoy too much, or games that I probably would never play again, ended up staying on my shelf instead of being given to GameStop for a grand total of 48 cents. After a while, I found myself longing to play old favorites that I had regrettably sold as a kid, and even wanting to replay games I hadn't necessarily liked back then, wondering if I was just too young to appreciate them at the time. As I continued to fill out my library of physical games, I eventually noticed that it wasn't just a few games stacked on my bookshelf anymore. This was becoming a proper collection. So I finally made a conscious decision not to get rid of my old games anymore. And that decision is what set me on the path to one day being the man who will once again own a physical copy of Tomodachi Life for the 3DS. Doesn't seem like that's going to happen anytime soon. But until that fateful day comes, I thought it might be fun to talk about the hobby of video game collecting as a whole, and reflect on how my own collection has taken shape throughout the past few years that I've been building it. Honestly, despite how enjoyable it is, video game collecting can be pretty hard sometimes. That sounds kinda dumb, right? Like, what's so hard about going to the store and walking out with a chibi robo? That! When you consider the pitfalls that come with looking for older titles, the problem that some collectors might face start to become a little clearer. I've been filling out my collection with a lot of retro games lately, but it's becoming increasingly difficult to find many of these games at all, let alone at reasonable prices. When you're dealing with games that are no longer in print, you're pretty much relying exclusively on what other people are giving up. The first system that I ever had to call my own was the Nintendo DS. Growing up throughout the 7th generation of gaming meant that many of the first games I played during my childhood were for the DS and Wii. That's probably the reason that I love collecting for these systems so much, especially when it comes to the DS. One of the most satisfying finds in a retro game store for me is a complete in-box DS game, although it's much more common to find loose cartridges instead. I have a whole cabinet in my house that's full of old DS game cases with no game cartridges inside. One day I think that it might be fun to collect all those games that I had as a kid that I still have the cases for, but I don't know if it would be worth going through all that trouble just for Crayola Treasure Adventures. Even if I don't ever get around to that, I still love collecting any DS games that I find interesting. A few recent pickups for the DS that I was really happy with were the legendary Starfy and the Drawn to Life collection. Starfy was a game that I had always loved back from when I was a kid, even though I never actually had the game. A friend of mine had it though, and he showed me a bunch of it and even let me play some of it for myself. After playing through it fully for the first time recently, completely for video research purposes and not just because I wanted an excuse to finally play Starfy, I realized that I missed out on a really special game from my childhood DS collection. Did you know that this guy's a prince? It's a pretty simple platformer in terms of mechanics, but it has a really unique identity that helps it stand out. Starfy has such a fun moveset that makes him a joy to control, and I was shocked by just how much content was packed into the game. There's already so much to do in the main game, but it also has a bunch of great minigames included in the package too. I'm really glad that I finally got around to playing Starfy. Now, the Drawn to Life collection, on the other hand, was a game that I had for myself when I was younger. Kind of. I had both the original Drawn to Life as well as Drawn to Life the Next Chapter for the DS, but ended up selling them both at some point because I was stupid. I loved both Drawn to Life games so much. The first game in particular is really important to me. I have such vivid memories of playing the original around Christmas time when I was really little. As a kid who was always drawing and trying to create things of his own, Drawn to Life allowed me the freedom to put my very own creations into a real video game, and I thought that idea was so cool. Even though the game is fairly simplistic, I think it holds up pretty well even today. Combine that with the amazing music and the story that was definitely maybe not supposed to be suitable for kids, and you get a truly incredible game. I managed to get both of these games for really cheap at a retro game store in my area, and I was really lucky to have found them. They were just loose cartridges instead of complete in-box copies, but if I want the game bad enough, I'm more than willing to pick up the cartridge by itself. Shopping in person at local retro game stores is always a great time, even when I don't end up buying anything. Just having the chance to look around and see all the different systems and consoles lining the shelves is a lot of fun, especially when there's older titles that you wouldn't really find in other kinds of stores. They've got games in stock for all of the systems that I had growing up, like the DS, Wii, Xbox 360, 3DS, and Wii U. I don't buy a lot of Wii games these days, even though I'm sure I did a lot of misguided selling of these games from my childhood Wii collection. I feel like I still have all the games that I would realistically want to play on my Wii. I was trying to track down Kirby's Epic Yarn for a long time recently, and I'm really happy to have finally gotten my hands on that. Sadly, I sold my entire Xbox 360 collection including the console itself when I was younger, which really sucks because I've been feeling really nostalgic lately for some of those 360 era multiplat games. I still have most of my 3DS games that were a part of my childhood collection, since the 3DS was still being supported around the time that I stopped selling old games. Not the Wii U though. After the brutalization of my old Wii U collection, I only have 4 Wii U games left. So because of the history I have of being a fucking stupid kid, now I'm mainly interested in rebuilding these old collections somewhat, and collecting games that I never experienced for these consoles back in the day. And that's one of the things that I think is really fun about game collecting. Each person's collection, no matter how many games they have in common, is going to be pretty different. Everyone has their own story with different games and consoles that drives them to collect what they're specifically interested in. A game collection isn't just about the cases lining the shelves, it's about the memories that the games represent for that collector. The games that one person has fun collecting just might not appeal to the tastes of another collector. Like, I'd love to get back into collecting for the 360 someday, but you wouldn't catch me dead dropping money on games for the modern Xbox. It's just not the ecosystem that I prefer to play my games on. I have no emotional connection to the current Xbox brand or any of the games that are released on their platforms, so instead I focus my energy on other systems. Emotional connection? It's a plastic box. But you get my point. Basically, there aren't any rules for game collecting. What's satisfying to collect for one person might not be for another for a variety of reasons. People who aren't interested in the same consoles or the same genres of games aren't going to have collections that look similar to each other at all. But each one will have a story behind it regardless. Just collect games that you think you'd have fun playing at some point for consoles that you actually care about. As long as you're doing that, you're doing it right, and don't let anyone tell you anything different. Unless you're spending hundreds of dollars for, I don't know, fucking Cubivore. But what if you've been trying to get your hands on a certain game for so long, but you just can't find it for a reasonable price? Well, that's where websites like price charting come in. I haven't really used price charting much myself in the past, but I've heard it thrown around in conversations about game collecting, so I thought it'd be a good idea to check the site out for myself and talk about it a little bit. Price charting is a tool that you can use to quickly see what the average value for a specific video game is at the moment. They also have price info and trading cards and comics too, so it seems like it would be pretty useful for all sorts of collectors. Basically, what it does is take selling information from eBay and puts it through their own algorithm to figure out what the current market price for the game would be. It has graphs to show you how the game's price has changed over time, and also shows a history of recent sales from eBay, with the necessary information surrounding that particular copy of the game and how much it sold for. The algorithm takes a bunch of different parameters into consideration, such as the most recent sale price or the game's average price in order to calculate the game's current value. It seems like a pretty good tool for quickly discovering the price that a game might be going for at the moment, but I don't think it should be the only thing that a collector relies on either. While doing research about price charting, I found that it seems like there's a fair bit of skepticism when it comes to its accuracy. Apparently it doesn't always correctly account for stuff like the quality that the game and its packaging are in, the completeness of the packaging, or if the game is an unofficial reproduction. These are all definitely important factors that go into making a decision about whether or not to buy a pre-owned game, so I totally understand why people would be irritated that the service doesn't factor this information into its algorithm, causing them to not take it too seriously. I looked up the value of a few games on price charting to see what they were going for, and then compared them with eBay listings that were up when I was writing this. For the most part, it does seem like the average prices that price charting lists for these games matches up with the general range of how much the games are selling for on eBay, but it does fluctuate slightly depending on the seller, although I would assume that's to be expected. I'd say that it's best used to get a quick read on how the overall market for a game might be looking at the moment, but it shouldn't necessarily influence your final purchasing decision. You should also look at what current eBay listings are looking like, and then jump on it if you can find it for a reasonable price. With older games that are no longer being produced or sold in stores, their overall value is highly subjective, and pretty much completely depends on both the buyer and the seller's valuation of the title. Retro game stores and most eBay sellers would probably use the average price of a game as a guide as to what to sell their copy for, but there's always going to be those people that are trying to sell a copy of a game at an absurdly high price for no real reason at all. Now, there's another little trap that unsuspecting game collectors can easily walk into when it comes to collecting retro games, and that's the issue of reproduction cartridges. I didn't know all too much about reproduction carts prior to doing research for this video, but I ended up learning some really interesting stuff about them. I'm sure there's a debate to be had about whether collectors who want a truly authentic experience should even consider buying unofficial reproductions of games, and I could definitely see both sides. I personally prefer playing my games on the official hardware that they were released on. To me, that's what I feel provides me with the most authentic experience. That, combined with a desire to own my games physically, is why I don't really mess around with emulation as much as I used to these days. But even with playing games on the official hardware that they were made for, you might not be lucky enough to be playing an official copy of the game itself. Reproduction carts are unofficially produced game cartridges that can sometimes get mixed in with the sale of officially released retro titles. I've mostly seen them pop up every now and then when looking into buying Game Boy Advance or DS cartridges online. The only reason I can even tell is because sometimes the sellers are nice enough to let you know in the listing that the game is a reproduction and not an official copy. It's always best to know what you're getting into when buying something that might be suspected as a reproduction. I once saw a listing of Pokemon Fire Red on eBay for like $15, and that immediately made me think that it would be a reproduction. Like, have you seen the prices that older Pokemon titles sell for? Since reproductions aren't produced by the official manufacturers, there could be a handful of problems that you might face when dealing with them. I've heard that cheaply made reproduction cards can possibly cause some serious electrical damage to the systems they're being played on down the line due to faulty manufacturing. That would be a pretty major issue to run into for sure, but there are also smaller problems that could arise as a result of using repros. Save data could easily get corrupted, or the entire game could be broken in some way that makes it impossible to proceed past a certain point. There are definitely high-quality reproduction cartridges that are made though. I know that there's some kind of way to tell the difference between official and reproduction cartridges just by looking at them, but I can't tell the difference myself. There's a decent chance that I might have a few reproduction cards on my own GBA or DS collection without even knowing it, but I thankfully haven't run into any problems yet. I think it's always the right thing to do when a seller specifies that the game they're selling you is a reproduction. This way, the buyer knows that there could potentially be issues with the game sometime down the road. Due to the unofficial nature of reproduction games, they're usually vastly cheaper than official copies, which could be good for a collector who wants to play a game on official hardware by any means necessary. As long as the game works properly and I have them physically, I'm happy with what I've got, reproduction or official. One game that I have in my collection that I know is a reproduction is my copy of Mother 3 for the Game Boy Advance. More specifically, it's an unofficial cartridge of the Mother 3 fan translation. I saw a bunch of these at a retro game store one time and thought it was way too cool of a find to walk away without one. They were selling them for super cheap too, since they weren't officially produced cartridges. I haven't played through it all the way yet, but I've tested it out, and from what I've seen, it works great. I'm lucky to have the chance to be able to play it on my actual Game Boy Advance. Even though it isn't an official release, it's cool to have such an interesting game in my collection. Unofficial stuff can be really cool sometimes, especially if it's made with the actual intention to entertain and be sold in good faith. So far, I've only really been talking about the games I own physically, but I've amassed a pretty solid digital collection as well. Lately, I've been trying to make more of a conscious effort to buy my games physically rather than digitally. This doesn't mean that I've moved away from digital games completely though. I do love to partake in a good Steam sale from time to time. But even so, I prefer buying games physically for a lot of different reasons. With a lot of games getting their servers shut down or delisted from online storefronts, it's made me think a lot more about the importance of physical media and actually physically owning my games. But above all, it's just fun for me to buy more plastic boxes to line my shelf of sadness and despair. Even though I'm becoming more and more of a fan of physical media, digital games do have a few advantages over physical copies that are impossible to ignore. One of the biggest reasons to go digital instead of physical with games is the convenience factor. Digital games don't take up any space on the shelf, and it's undeniably convenient to have games downloaded to your system so you can play them whenever you want without having to pop a disc in. Some games, mainly smaller titles or ones that encourage multiple playthroughs, feel like they were just made for the digital form factor. Just having something available on your system at all times that you can pick up and play for a few minutes here and there can be really great. Another thing that makes digital games a lot more convenient than physical games is their availability at release. For the most part, physical games are still mass-produced, unless they're limited for one reason or another, but the industry is consistently trying to move towards an all-digital future. I don't really pre-order games anymore because I like to look at reviews before I spend money on a game, but if I'm feeling particularly confident that a game I'm looking forward to will be good, I'll try and buy it on release day. If you absolutely have to have a game right at release and can't track down a physical copy, buying it digitally is probably your best option. You don't have to go out to get it at a store or wait for it to be delivered to you if you order it online. You can just have it and download it instantly. Something that I've been noticing lately whenever I go to GameStop, at least at the one near me, is that they only get enough physical copies in for the amount of pre-orders that they receive for the game at launch. This is really upsetting to me because it just seems like further confirmation that companies are continuing to move away from physical media. They aren't getting rid of it completely yet, but they're slowly changing the way physical games are distributed in order to phase them out little by little. I don't usually pre-order games, so this really works against me if I want a game day one. It is what it is though. I know that we're moving towards a primarily digital future when it comes to our media, even if I would personally prefer to have it physically a majority of the time. But there is one more reason that I sometimes decide to buy digital over physical, and it's a big one: Steam sales. Steam sales really do offer one of the greatest values in gaming, especially their summer and winter sales. Steam sales happen pretty frequently too. Even if it isn't a big seasonal sale, there's always some sort of themed event on the platform, with a bunch of games in a specific genre going on sale, and individual games go on sale relatively often too. I also buy a lot of the indie games that I play digitally on Steam. Due to their smaller budgets and oftentimes a lack of big publishers backing developers, a lot of indie games get physical releases a pretty long time after they release, if they even get them at all. It's really a shame that it takes the extra time for indie developers to get their games out physically, but I totally understand it. Indie developers are always taking a huge risk when they put their games out. Most indie developers simply wouldn't have the extra budget to devote to producing physical copies of their games. They would rather spend that money ensuring that their game turns out the best it possibly can. A lot of popular indie games get released physically after the game has been out for a few months because the developers often put the profit that they earn from that game's initial release towards providing fans with a physical copy of their game. That's why I don't really have that many physical indie games, even though I'd really like to. It's a trade-off between playing the game closer to when it releases or waiting an unconfirmed amount of time to get the game physically, and usually I'd rather just play the game sooner. Actually, the only indie games that I have physically in my collection are Overcooked 1 and 2 and Sifu. One indie game that I'd really like to get physically one day is A Space for the Unbound. It's one of my favorite games of all time, so having it physically would be really cool. It's available physically on both PS5 and Switch, so I should definitely get around to grabbing it someday. Honestly, having my top 10 favorites all physically would be great, but I'd say I probably have half that list physically and the other half digitally. Maybe one day I'll make a point of getting my favorites physically, but I don't think I need to do that right now. But now we come to the million-dollar question, perhaps quite literally. How can you get into game collecting? Well, there's a lot of different ways to go about it, but no one way is better than any other. Basically, I think you should always start out with what you're most interested in. When I think of my own methods of collecting, I tend to break my collecting habits down into collecting new releases that I'm actively paying attention to and keeping up with as they release, and retro games that I know I'm interested in picking up someday but don't yet have in my collection for one reason or another. Obviously, newer releases are easier to collect due to their higher availability and stagnant market price. In comparison, the price and availability of retro titles is often completely up in the air due to their now limited quantity of copies for sale. This isn't to say that collecting one of either of these two categories is necessarily better than the other, it's just that there's a bit more consistency involved in the process of collecting new releases. When talking about new releases, there's a pretty wide range of games that can be discussed. I think a good cutoff point for what can be considered a new release in terms of video game collecting is the beginning of the current console generation. New is a pretty subjective term for sure, but that's the kind of loose definition that I usually go with. Like I said before, it's a lot easier to know what you're getting into when you're buying a recently released game. Information about the game, like reviews, are more relevant and readily available, and there would be a lot more recent discussion about the game that could help influence your purchasing decision. On top of this, there's a lot less risk of used copies being damaged or having just been worn down over time. Sometimes, although not super often, used copies of newer games can actually be substantially cheaper than buying a new copy, making it totally worth it to buy used instead. I've noticed recently that a lot of used PS4 games seem to be sold for pretty good prices at places like GameStop or other used game stores. It makes sense since they're from the last console generation, but PS4 games aren't outdated yet at all. Since the PS5 is backwards compatible with PS4 games, it could be a great idea to pick up some used copies of PS4 games that you might have missed out on last generation on the cheap. This is something that I'd definitely like to start doing more of. I try to keep up with new releases that I'm interested in as they come out and get games I really want close to their release, but a lot of games can end up slipping through the cracks from time to time, especially during months with really packed release schedules like this past fall had been. I'd say that focusing on new releases is the easiest and most convenient way to either continue adding to a game collection, or for starting a brand new one. This way you can continuously build up a collection and add to it at a steady pace. There are always going to be great games continuing to release, and assuming that there's something coming out that you're interested in playing every now and then, there will always be consistent progress to your collection, which I think is really satisfying. But like I mentioned before, I've been adding a lot more retro games to my collection as well recently. Retro games can be a lot trickier to get your hands on though, especially when taking their price and condition into consideration. Since the games aren't being produced or sold physically in mainstream stores anymore, they aren't nearly as readily available as recent releases. But I think that's also a little bit of the fun that comes with collecting retro games. Hunting down good deals can be pretty exciting, and finding a game that you've been looking for a long time can be a great feeling. Although finding high-quality retro games can require a little bit more effort from the collector, it could end up feeling even more rewarding as well. There's a lot of different ways to go about finding retro games, each with varying levels of reliability to them. My favorite of all of these is definitely going out to retro game stores and shopping in person. I'm lucky enough to have two really good retro game stores pretty close to where I live. Even if I don't buy anything while I'm there, just being in that kind of environment makes for a really great time. Being surrounded by retro games and consoles that you wouldn't really expect to see at all at a physical store, and being able to take your time browsing through them while seeing other people shopping for the same reason as you is really cool. That in-person factor is really important to me. The ability to shop at my leisure and physically see the games right there in front of me always makes me feel more confident in my purchasing decisions. You can check out the condition of the game for yourself, like what shape the case is in and whether or not the disc is scratched. It's great for making sure that the game you're buying has been handled with care. Every time I see people trading in games at these stores, the employees always test the games before taking them to ensure that they actually work, which is obviously important so you don't get stuck with a broken game somewhere down the road. One of the stores I usually go to even cleans the discs before they hand them over to you when you buy a game. This is how I go about buying the majority of the retro games in my collection. I do usually go into stores like these with a few games in mind that I would be hoping to find, but the odds of what I'm specifically looking for actually being there aren't always so good. Honestly, a lot of the retro games I buy at these stores are more like impulse purchases than anything else. I often get surprised by a lot of the games that they have in stock at any given time, then end up going for a good deal on a game that I wasn't even thinking about looking for when I walked through the door that day. That's another thing that I love about having brick and mortar stores that specialize in selling retro games though. Seeing a game that's been in the back of your mind that you weren't actively looking for being sold at a store for a reasonable price is a great surprise. You can't really get a similar experience if you're shopping for a game on eBay. If you're looking for games on eBay, you probably have a pretty solid idea of the specific game you were looking for. At least that's usually how it's been in my experience. I just love the whole vibe that a good retro game store has. Usually it seems that most of the people that work at the ones that I've been to are also really passionate about video games, and that can lead to some great conversations. It also allows you to be able to ask questions about the stuff that you might be buying in order to make more informed purchasing decisions. And it's just cool to be in a place where the people in the store are all shopping there for the same reason as you. It's nice to have a place that focuses exclusively on my favorite hobby that I once believed was too niche to have its own store for. If you can find some retro game stores that are relatively close to your area, I'd definitely recommend giving them a shot. It might just end up being a store you visit regularly, whether it's just to shop around in a cool environment and see what games might stand out to you, or to hunt down some specific games that you've been looking for. Something else that popped up recently are the new GameStop retro stores. This is a new initiative that GameStop has started promoting, and I really like the idea of it. Basically, it's exactly like it sounds. Certain GameStop locations are dubbed as GameStop Retros, meaning that they carry a much wider selection of retro games than regular GameStops do. The announcement of this new idea of theirs was a great way to find out that people consider the Wii to be retro now. When I first heard about this, I was really excited. I know that plenty of people have their problems with how GameStop does things, and it's definitely never a perfect shopping experience when I go into one, but I think that it's incredibly important to have a store that's sole purpose is to sell video games. It's definitely a better way to buy games in store than getting them somewhere like Target or Walmart, in my opinion. I thought that if GameStop managed to execute this idea right, it would be a really good addition to a bunch of their stores, and that it could make retro games a lot more accessible. Shortly after they announced this, I checked their website to see if there were any GameStop Retros near me. There turned out to be one not too far from where I live, so I decided to check it out one day, and honestly, I was really not impressed. There was nothing wrong with the store itself, it was actually really nice, and quite big too, but the selection of retro games there was just really lackluster. The retro section was pretty much just 3 or 4 empty looking shelves with a couple of Wii, PS3, and Xbox 360 games on them, and it's not like any of the games they had there were real winners either. It was mostly just LEGO games and shovelware. There was also a pretty empty case that had some loose DS and 3DS cartridges in it, but I've seen cases like these at regular GameStops before too, so it didn't strike me as anything particularly groundbreaking. I didn't notice any cartridges for any older handhelds like the Game Boy line of systems, and I didn't see any other console games that went back any further than the 7th generation systems that I mentioned earlier. It was a pretty disappointing experience, sadly, and I walked out unimpressed and empty-handed. To be fair though, I literally went a few days after the GameStop retro stores were even announced to be a thing at all. I really hope that this can expand into something way better in the future, because it really is a great idea with a lot of potential, and it could maybe even breathe new life into GameStop as a brand, which has been struggling for a pretty long time now. So far, all it is a great idea with lackluster execution, but given enough time and support, I think it can become so much more than that. Hopefully they really focus on building this up. I think the existence of GameStop Retro could end up being really good for collectors. It would be a very accessible and consistent place to buy retro games at, and I just think more stores that sell retro games being around in general is always a good thing. Though it would really suck if GameStop Retro starts to draw customers away from smaller retro game stores that are privately owned. I think something that smaller stores will always have over GameStop Retro would be the sense of community that they foster. GameStop is very corporate in the way they operate, and I know for a fact that it turns a lot of people away from shopping at their stores. Plus, even if they are locations that would primarily focus on retro games, GameStop Retros are still regular GameStops as well, and there's always going to be the question of whether you'd like to pre-order anything or if you want to renew your membership. I do really hope that GameStop Retro can stick around and improve though, and I'd like to go back to one sometime again in the future to see if that's happened. Another method of collecting retro games that I've been making use of a lot more in recent years is buying them on eBay. I think eBay is a great place to find retro games, and usually for pretty fair prices too. I think it's best to go onto eBay with a specific game in mind if you're going to be buying from there. There are so many sellers on the platform selling all kinds of different games, so it can get kind of overwhelming if you aren't entirely sure what you're looking for. There are just so many options available to buyers on eBay that it can be kind of hard to make a decision sometimes. It's a great way to get a game relatively quickly if you can't find it in a store or something like that, and the price could potentially be even better too. I think the instant availability is my favorite part about buying games through eBay. I do think browsing used game stores and hunting down games or stumbling upon hidden gems is more fun, but sometimes I just want to find a specific game that I'm looking for right away, and I think eBay is the easiest way to do that. More often than not, there are going to be many different people on the site selling the game that you might be looking for. Of course, there's always going to be outliers too, people that will sell their copies of games for ridiculous prices that nobody should ever pay, but for the most part, prices of games on eBay tend to follow the general pricing trends of the games that they're selling pretty closely. There are also ways to find copies that might be a little cheaper than the usual price as well. Like, many collectors prefer to make sure that the games they buy are always complete in-box copies, meaning that they have the box, the game itself, and the manual that came with the game originally included in it. But that will also be one of the most expensive versions of the game that you could possibly buy. A copy of the game that comes without the manual might end up being around $10 cheaper, and depending on the kind of collector you are, that might be worth it to you. I personally don't mind missing the manual, and I'm even okay with loose cartridges, but if the game's a disc, it's gotta come with the case. I think the most important thing to remember when shopping on eBay though is to be an informed customer. I've personally never had a negative experience with an eBay purchase, but it's good to take in as much information about the game as you can on eBay since you're shopping for used products completely online. The condition of the game also has to be taken into account. Make sure the images of the game and the case look to be in decent shape, and check that the quality of the item is at the very least described as good or better, and you should be good to go. Damaged games might be a little cheaper than ones that are of better quality, but I personally don't think that the lower price is worth having a damaged game in your collection. I would be too worried that it might not work. There are all kinds of descriptions that sellers will add to their game, like the manual being included, if the copy is from a different region, or whether or not the game has been tested, and it's all useful information to have. Overall, while eBay does have its own pros and cons that come with it, I think it's a really great and accessible way to find retro games. If you get lucky, you might even get a really good deal. Finally, moving even further down the ladder in terms of reliability, I want to mention yard sales a bit. Last summer, me and one of my friends got really into going to yard sales every now and then, and we eventually even started seeking them out. It was cool to see all the stuff that people were selling in general, but we were both mainly in it to find some good video games. I don't think it comes as much of a surprise that I'd say that yard sales definitely shouldn't be your primary method of collecting. They're just too unreliable, infrequent, and might have you driving pretty long distances just to end up disappointed at the end of the day. However, if you're just interested in going to yard sales to check things out from time to time and you find it fun, there can sometimes be some quality gaming stuff to be found at a handful of them. This past summer, me and a few of my friends found 2 yard sales that were specifically selling used video games, and we made sure to check them both out. Although my friends got a couple things at the first one, I unfortunately didn't find anything I really wanted, but the other one is where I hit the jackpot. There were definitely a bunch of different games that I was interested in at this yard sale, but the item that I ended up purchasing was a PS2 Slim, and the guy running the yard sale was selling it for a super reasonable price. He was actually selling 3 of them, so my friend ended up getting one too. I didn't get any actual games at that yard sale though, mainly because I didn't want to overspend. I had been thinking of getting a PS2 for a little while prior to my friend finding this yard sale because there were a lot of PS2 games that I was really interested in playing, one in particular being Eco. Eco was pretty much the main reason that I got the PS2, so my next goal was to find myself a copy. I probably could have gone to eBay to buy a copy, but I wasn't really in any rush to find one right away. But one day, while browsing one of the retro game stores near me, I found it. My golden goose, a complete in-box copy of Eco for PS2, and for a really cheap price too. I bought this without a second thought, and I've been slowly building up my PS2 collection ever since. I hope that throughout this video, I've managed to convey just how important the hobby of game collecting, and really just gaming as a whole, is to me. I wouldn't have poured nearly as much time into building up my collection if I felt otherwise. I wouldn't say that my collection is small by any means, but I don't think it's particularly huge either, and I'm actually very happy with its current size. I only really go out of my way to collect games that I'm either interested in playing at some point, or games that I had lost from my childhood that I want to play again. I think the specific way that I collect games makes my personal collection even more special to me. It's much easier to feel a connection to the games in your collection when you don't have an overwhelming amount of them and have actually played most of them. I feel that connection with my own collection, and I'm sure many other game collectors feel that way with theirs. Video game collecting is great because there aren't any real rules to it. Everyone has their own story with specific games in their collection that makes up their own personal feelings to their entire collection overall. I'm never going to have the same exact collection as someone else, or have had an identical experience with a game as someone else, and I just love that. Hearing about the crown jewels of other people's collections and why they feel that way is really interesting to me, and seeing the impressive collections or game rooms that others have built up over the years is always a lot of fun too. I'd love it if hearing me talk about this hobby that I'm so passionate about has reminded some of you watching about your feelings about your own collections. And if so, I'd love to hear some of your stories in the comments as well. To wrap up, I wanted to show off a bit of what my collection is currently looking like at the moment. I obviously won't be able to show everything, but I'll be focusing on some of my favorite games in the collection, as well as some that I think are rare or could potentially become rare in the future, and even a few weird anomalies that I've picked up along the way. Here I've got a few of the things that I'm looking forward to showing today. Just the essentials. You know, like squeeballs. I'll try to structure the order of the games that I show in a way that makes sense, but sorry if some of the games seem a little random or out of place. The part of my collection that I'm most excited about at the moment is my PS2 collection, which I've just recently started putting together. So far, the games that I've decided to get for it are God of War 1 and 2, Sly Cooper, and Eco. I also recently got Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi as a gift from a friend. God of War 2 was the first game that I picked up for the system, and I found it at a retro game event that I went to over the summer. I'm pretty sure it was the only game that I got that day, but I was more than happy with it, since I've been wanting to play through the original God of War trilogy ever since I played God of War 2018. The PS2 game that I'm most excited to have in my collection is Eco. Like I mentioned before, Eco is pretty much the entire reason that I bought my PS2. I saw a video about it one time and thought that it looked so different and interesting that I really wanted to give it a try at some point. Combine that with all the other great games and series that got their start on the PS2, and it eventually prompted me to start looking for one. I didn't have any games for the PS2 for a decent amount of time after getting it, but Ico was definitely the golden goose that I was chasing for my PS2 collection. But talking of a golden goose, another game that I would have considered to be on that level is Kirby's Epic Yarn for the Wii. It was another game that I had when I was a kid, and I could never find it at any retro game stores. I'm sure I could have found it easily on eBay, but for some reason I never thought to check. But finally, when I took a day to go to both the retro game stores near me with some friends in preparation for writing this script, I found it at the first one we went to. I actually found Ico there that same day as well, so those were my pickups at that store. I was so happy that I had found Kirby's Epic Yarn after so long of never having seen it at the other retro game store that I frequent. But when me and my friends made our way to that other one later in the day, I saw another copy there, and for $5 cheaper than what I had bought it for. I wasn't upset about it though. I had already gotten my copy for pretty cheap, and I was just happy to finally have Kirby's Epic Yarn back. I think that whole encounter made for a pretty funny story though. The last game that I got that day was Yokai Watch for the 3DS. I had played a bit of Yokai Watch in the past when it first came out, but I never had a copy myself, even though I was always interested in it. I saw it for pretty cheap, complete in box, which was rare for 3DS games at this store, so I decided to take a chance and finally see what the game was like. I've also got a small N64 collection going right now. So far, the only games that I have for it are the original Smash Bros. And Banjo Kazooie, but I think these are great ones to have. I don't think there's much to say about Smash 64, but it's really cool to have the game that started the most prolific crossover fighting series of all time. Even though I got Banjo a while ago, I still haven't beaten it yet, but I've really liked what I've played of it so far, and I can see why it has such a great reputation. The world is really whimsical and all the levels are a lot of fun to explore because of that. I don't necessarily think that many N64 games seem to hold up all that well, but Banjo Kazooie seems like a bit of an exception. I love the sense of humor that the game has, and that kind of comedy really carries over into everything you can do in the game, like Banjo's moveset, the power-ups you can get, and the characters you meet, and I just love that. It gives the game a real sense of identity and charm. I'm definitely going to come back to this game and finish it someday soon. I think this one's pretty cool. This is my copy of Infamous Second Son, but it's actually a PAL copy. I got this when I was visiting my family in Greece a couple years ago, and I think it's a fun little anomaly to have in my collection. I know that a lot of people don't really like to have different regional variants of games in their collections, but I think that having a couple of them here and there can be kinda cool. It's playable in English even though a lot of the text on the back of the box is Greek, and the PS4 isn't region locked, so I should have no trouble playing this at all. I haven't gotten around to it yet, but I definitely will at some point. I'm really interested in exploring some of the older franchises in Sony's history that they aren't really making use of at the moment. Another game I have that comes from another region is my copy of Like a Dragon Gaiden: The Man Who Erased His Name for PS5. The game actually never got a physical release here in the US, which really sucked for me at first, since I had wanted to start collecting all the new Yakuza releases physically. But I ended up getting this copy from PlayAsia, and it's the English version too, so I'll thankfully be able to understand what all the text says in the game. Same as with my copy of Infamous Second Son, I think it's kinda cool and weird to have a non-ESRB game in my collection. This bright red English version denotation on the spine is a bit of an eyesore, but I'd much rather have the game physically than digitally, since the Yakuza series is my favorite game series of all time. I have most of the previous Yakuza titles up until Yakuza Like a Dragon digitally, but I've made the decision to buy them all physically going forward. Here's my copy of Infinite Wealth, too. I haven't played either one of these games yet, since I've only played up to Yakuza 6 and I don't want to burn myself out by playing the games back to back, but I know that I'll love both these games when I eventually get to them. I'll be coming for the Majima Pirate game soon enough, too. The last game that I have in my collection that's from a different region is my copy of Pokemon White for the DS. This was also another pickup from when I was visiting family in Greece, but from a really long time ago. It looks pretty weird on my shelf next to all the other DS games since it has the big clear case that makes it stand out, but I have such great memories with this game, and it always reminds me of my trips to Greece, specifically ones from when I was younger. The Minish Cap is one of my favorite Zelda games. I think that I originally played this on the Wii U's Virtual Console, and I loved it, so I'm really happy to have my own physical copy of it now. I think it's great that my copy came with one of those custom DS turned GBA cases so that I've got someplace to store it. Right now I just keep loose Game Boy cartridges on top of my DS cases on my shelf since I don't have a case to hold them in. The Minish Cap having its own custom case means that I can fit it on the shelf right next to my DS games. It looks a little out of place since it's the only one of its kind, and Game Boy Advance games never actually came in plastic cases, but I'm happy to have it in one. Here's my copy of Golden Sun, and I've also got my Mother 3 cartridge here too. I still think this is so cool. Having a physical cartridge of a fan translation ROM that I can play on official hardware is really great. And here's my Game Boy Advance. I remember that I initially bought the original version of the GBA instead of the SP because all my friends had SPs, and I wanted to be different. And then I realized that the original model of the GBA didn't have a backlight, and I've never been able to live that decision down. My GBA is kinda beat up, It's covered in scratches, and it's missing the battery cover on the back, but I bought this used from Amazon a really long time ago, before I was too concerned with what the condition of the things I bought were in. I've also got my original DS here too, the first game system that I ever owned, still in that silly looking Nerf case that I got for it all those years ago. I have so many memories with this thing, and it's the system that put me on the path to where I am today, depressed, so I've got it to thank for that too. But in all seriousness, this system still holds a really special place in my heart, and it's a great way to play GBA games on a screen that I can actually see. Here I've got two big winners from my childhood, Drawn to Life and Mario & Luigi Bowser's Inside Story. I'm sad to say that neither of these are my original copies from when I was younger. Both games were victims of my foolish selling spree for new games, but I'm so happy to have both games back in my collection again. But it does kinda bother me that the case I have here for Drawn to Life is from my original copy that I had when I was younger, but the actual cartridge I have is not for Drawn to Life, but for the Drawn to Life collection instead. Truly soul-crushing stuff, I know. Just like the story of this game that's supposed to be meant for kids. I'm just happy to have both these games physically again though, and to have been able to experience them again was truly incredible. But for as much as Drawn to Life means to me, Bowser's Inside Story might be even more meaningful. For most of my life, Bowser's Inside Story was my favorite game of all time, and even now, it's still like number 3 on that list. It's just such a creative game. Everything about this game, from its combat, to its world and exploration, to its art and music, and even its story is all so perfect. It's a game that I really have a lot of nostalgia for, and I think it's absolutely the highest point of the Mario & Luigi series. On the Switch, there are 2 games in my collection that I wanted to get quickly after they came out because I felt like they might end up being rare at some point since they launched digitally first and then later got physical editions, which I assumed would be pretty limited. Those games are Metroid Prime Remastered and Pikmin 1+2. I didn't buy these games just because I thought they might be rare someday, but also because I really did want to play them. I'm not too big into Metroid, but I do love games that fit into the Metroidvania genre. The only other Metroid game I've played is Metroid Dread, and that was only pretty recently. But I'm excited to give Metroid Prime a chance sometime, and see what makes it so special for so many people. But now, these fuckers. I also only started understanding the appeal of Pikmin within the past few years, but I'm so happy to say that I finally get Pikmin now. So far I've played both Pikmin 3 Deluxe and Pikmin 4, and I loved both games, so I have no doubt that I'm gonna have a great time with the first 2 Pikmin games as well. Little guys walking around in regular-sized environments that appear giant to them is one of my favorite tropes in fiction in general, so the whole vibe of these games really appeals to me. I'm really happy to have every game in the series, and all on the same console too. They look great next to each other on the shelf. These are seriously some great games here. I love these little freaks. There are also 2 consoles that belonged to my dad before he gave them to me, those being the original Xbox and the NES. My collection for the Xbox is pretty small. So far the only games I have are Halo Combat Evolved and Fable, but I'm really excited to try both of these out, especially Fable. I'm not a huge FPS guy, but the first Halo is iconic, and I think that I'll still have a lot of fun with it, because I've heard it's just that good. I am, however, definitely a big RPG guy, which is why I'm even more excited to play through Fable. People talk about the original Xbox very fondly, and while I did experience the Xbox 360 era for myself in its prime, I'd like to see what exclusives Xbox had to show for themselves on their first ever console. I do have a lot of games for the NES, pretty much all of them being hand-me-downs, but I think the coolest one to have is the Golden Zelda cartridge. It can be pretty confusing to play through due to the lack of direction given in the game, but it's still fun enough. I don't really think that too many NES games hold up all that well besides a select few, but I think the console itself is a huge piece of gaming history that makes up a really interesting part of my collection. Rapid fire time. Just because I don't have too much to say about any of these games, but I still think they're really cool pieces of my collection. Project Cross Zone. I just got this back recently after having sold my initial copy, and I'm super excited to play it again. Pokemon Yellow. I have no idea how or when I got this, but I love that I have it. Even though I don't necessarily love playing through Gen 1 since it really shows its age, it's so cool to have one of the games that started it all. Again, it being depression. Mario Galaxy 1 and 2. 2 is actually my original copy from when I was a kid, and I love both of these games. I've always been more of a 2 guy personally, probably just because I never had the original when I was growing up, but they're both great regardless. Red Dead Redemption 2. This one's definitely on my top 10 games of all time list for sure. I love this game's story so much. I really want to get the original Red Dead Redemption at some point to see what happens next. And finally, Skylanders for the 3DS. I have no more Skylanders, no Portal of Power. I gave those all to my cousin. So why the fuck do I still have Skylanders? And for the 3DS of all systems? I keep this because it's funny. And that's just a couple of the games in my collection that I thought would be the most fun to talk about today. I really love talking about this kind of stuff, and I hope that's been clear to see throughout the video. Video game collecting is a wonderful hobby, one that builds upon and adds to the enjoyment of gaming as a whole, at least in my opinion. I'm very happy with the state that my collection is in right now, and I'm not really making an active effort to grow it at the moment. There are a few games that I missed out on in 2024 that I'd like to pick up at some point, but I'm in no rush. While it can be fun to just simply buy games as a collector, it is important to remember to actually play them too. I don't really like buying games just for the sake of having them, and I have every intention to play through and hopefully finish as many games in my collection as I possibly can. It would be cool to try and recollect all the games that I foolishly got rid of when I was younger, but that would probably take way too much time to do. I still think it would be a fun goal to slowly chip away at, though. But this is just how I like to collect. My game collection is important to me for my own reasons, and someone else's collection could be equally important to them for completely different reasons, and that's one of the things that's so great about game collecting. There's no one right way to collect as long as you're having fun while doing it. Just remember to collect the games that you're interested in, for whatever reason that might be, and spend responsibly, because game collecting is an expensive hobby. Playing and talking about games is one of the things that I'm most passionate about, and I'm glad that I got the chance to discuss game collecting and document a solid chunk of my own collection here today. There are so many different interesting facts that make up game collecting, and each of them could definitely warrant an entire discussion on their own. It was a lot of fun learning about certain aspects of it that I didn't know much about beforehand, such as reproduction cartridges. I'd love to hear about some of your collections as well, so feel free to leave a comment about it if you're interested in sharing. At the end of the day, a game's worth is subjective, and dependent upon the value that the player places on their experience with it. I think game preservation is really important, and I'm happy that I can preserve not only the games, but the memories I've made with some of my favorite games through my own collection. I hope that I was able to show you how much fun game collecting can be, and maybe even inspire some of you to start your own collections, or think about what your current collection means to you. No matter what kind of collection you might have, whether it's large or small, it's worth more than its monetary value alone due to its importance to you.